Welcome. We are continuing our discussion of early modern philosophy, and this time around we're going to be looking at one of the more notable figures who's often brought up in the discussion of early modern metaphysics, and that's Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, this will be the first of our two sessions on Leibniz. This one will look at questions related to God and free will. The next one will look at innate ideas. There's certainly more that could be said about Leibniz for constraints of time and also making the dialectical narrative fit. We won't be looking at Leibniz's book, The Monadology, directly. So there's much to be said about Leibniz. But today, we're just going to be looking at some questions about God and God's nature and a really interesting approach to free will that Leibniz gets us. Now, the funny thing about Leibniz's approach to free will is that some of you might find it nuanced and insightful, a new way of thinking about free will that can get us out of a bunch of questions and troubles. To others of you, you might find the view incoherent. You might just say, it seems like Leibniz, in developing his defense of free will, is basically painting himself into a corner or perhaps contradicting himself. So that's where we're going to be looking today, and I will leave it to you to figure out whether Leibniz has something insightful or whether he has something incoherent to say. First question, what is the nature of God? We've seen a couple answers to that question throughout the term. Most notably, we saw Descartes telling us that God is the most perfect being who is no deceiver. We also saw Spinoza saying that, God might have perfections in a certain way, but we also wouldn't want to treat God as something like a person. For Spinoza, God is something more like the great big, necessarily existent everything. So, in a certain way, Leibniz's view about God is quite similar to Descartes'. So Leibniz, like Descartes, is going to say that God is this most perfect being. And in a certain way, God is personal. That is, God is like an individual with thoughts and feelings, and maybe we might even say a perspective. Now, Leibniz brings in a nice little bit of conceptual clearing out. He points out that God has all the perfections. God, if there's something that you can be perfect in, then God will have all of those perfections in the highest degree. But we should notice that not every property can be perfected. So consider the property of height. Even if you consider, for instance, the tallest person in the world, I don't know, maybe that's somebody who's maybe 7'6" or 8 foot. But we can always imagine, even if a person were in this world at the height of 8 feet, we might notice that it's at least possible that somebody could be 8'1", right? So you would say that, every time you think of a height, you can always just add another inch to it. This means that there is no highest degree of height. And so we wouldn't ask the question, given that God is a perfect being, what height would God have to be? Well, that's not the kind of quality that is a perfection. But Leibniz is going to tell us that power, knowledge, and moral perfection are perfections that can be had to the highest degree. So to that extent, we would say God is the most perfect being, would have the highest degree of power, the highest degree of knowledge, and the highest degree of moral perfection. If we zoom in on this question of the power of God, Leibniz is also really keen to point out that having power means that you can do a lot with a little. So we might say it's not like a God has to invent a new principle for every single phenomenon that he brings about. So it's not like God needs to have the power to both grow grass and the power to grow trees. No, instead, he might have a more general power to bring life into existence. Or maybe even something more general than that. Something about being able to regulate certain laws of nature and laws of physics that are going to give rise to things like both trees and grass. Now, within this picture of God as a most perfect being with all the perfections, this is going to give us what Leibniz calls, or not, he doesn't actually use this term, but we could say that this is a rather traditional view of God, which is a view of God that treats him as omniscient, that is all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and to the max degree of moral goodness. This is sometimes referred to as omnibenevolence, even though maybe that's a bit of a misnomer, because it's not as if moral perfection is completely contained in the concept of benevolence. There might be more to ethics than that. Now, on this picture, we get what we might call, and this is not Leibniz's term, but this is a term that's used in certain discussions of theology and philosophy of religion. We can talk about the triple O God. So oftentimes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, our main Abrahamic religions especially, they are often seen as characterizing God as possessing all three of these omni properties, right? So we might say, God is very special because God has all of these three properties. We might also notice that omniscience, we could almost like collapse that into omnipotence. So if you think that knowledge is just one way of having or expressing power, then we might even sort of mix together for God's nature this ability to do anything, including know everything, and a certain kind of goodness. Now, this leads us to a question, and this is the question that gives rise to what's called theodicy, this question of how evil exists in the world. There's the question, could God have made things better? We already saw Descartes answer this term, and Descartes told us that, well, God couldn't have made things better in the sense that God gave us free will, and when we have free will, we are going to make mistakes. Now, this question of free will and whether God is allowing bad things to happen, or that God could have made things better, the way that Leibniz approaches this question is going to be somewhat different from how Descartes approaches this question. So Descartes is going to say things could have been better, but because God gave us free will, he didn't make them better. But Leibniz is just going to straight up say, no, God could not have made things any better than they are. So this is the famous claim that's often attributed to Leibniz, because he says it. Leibniz tells us that the world that we are living in, this world is the best of all possible worlds, right? So things could not have been better than this. God, as omnipotent and omnibenevolent, would say, actually, God is bringing about this rich variety of effects from a small number of powers, and this shows God to be as perfect as could be. Now, we might already notice there's a way in which we could maybe like quickly and easily put pressure on this view. One way of putting pressure on this view is to point to Leibniz, hey, what about my suffering? What about the fact that, my body fails me in many ways, and it's not as if that's making the world a better place in any way. And we could talk about animal suffering and hurricanes and so on and so forth. Well, Leibniz is still going to have to say, if he really wants to stick with this view, things really couldn't be any better. And part of how he's going to have to say this is he's going to have to say, we humans, with our limited amounts of knowledge, can't understand the complexity of God's plans. Now, here's another way of going. We might say, like, this is the best of all possible worlds because morality is subjective. Some people will say that, right? They'll say that whatever God says is good is good. So some people might say, like, look, laws of morality. We might also say the laws of logic, right? So, we might say, like, a logical law, like modus ponens, if P then Q, P, therefore Q. We might say that the logical validity of that inference might be an invention of God, such that God could make modus ponens invalid. Or, we might also ask the question, could God make it the case that 2 + 2 = 5? And not in the boring way of just changing the name of 4 to the word 5, but could he literally make this many things and this many things add up to this many things, right? So that's going to be our question. And some people are going to say, we should say that God could alter the laws of morality. We might say God created the universe, and it seems like, given that all truths depend on God's making them true and maintaining them, that would apply for logic and morality as well. One way of putting this line of thought is that there are no laws without a lawgiver, and God is the creator of all the laws. But there are reasons to deny this view that God could make morality and logic say anything he felt like. First thing, if we just start believing that good or logical just are whatever God says is good or logical, then that would make the goodness of God completely arbitrary, right? They would be like necessary consequences of God's nature, and then we would just say, like, look, we wouldn't be saying anything new when we said that, like, God has a nature, God made things. We're not just saying that God made what he made, but God made something which is incredible, which actually has us look for a divine creator, right? So it wouldn't make sense to praise God for his actions if good only meant what God decrees, right? And in this way, when we create this world instead of another world, Leibniz is saying we are saying that it is the most good. We are not just saying that it is the world that God made for us. If this line of argument seems familiar to you, you shouldn't be surprised, because one of the most famous philosophical discussions comes in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, where Euthyphro tells us that that which is pious is that which the gods approve of. This line of discussion is drawn out by Socrates, and Socrates eventually asks Euthyphro, are things good because God loves them? Or does God love certain things because they're good? What Socrates points out is that if we just say that whatever the gods happen to love is that which is pious, then it would be arbitrary that certain things are pious or not. They could have made anything pious and for no more or less reason than anything else. But if we then say, look, maybe the gods are declaring certain things to be pious because they have certain features to them, then we would have to say that, well, there is a standard of morality that exists prior to and independent of God. or the gods in the case of ancient Greece. So we might think of Leibniz and Plato as kindred spirits here. We will also see this in later in the text, beyond what I assigned for reading, where Leibniz also approvingly cites Plato in his doctrine of innate ideas. So, whereas a lot of early modern thinkers were working on rebelling against ancient philosophers and scholastic philosophy, it's interesting to note that Leibniz considers himself a friend of ancient philosophy and the scholastics. But just to push ahead on this idea that we live in the best of all possible verses, we might consider this an extension of a certain kind of claim that you'll hear a lot in the world, and it's the claim that everything happens for a reason. Now, in our studies of Spinoza last week, we actually saw Spinoza defending a version of this idea that everything happens for a reason, when Spinoza defended what he called the principle of sufficient reason. Remember, Spinoza said, for each fact that is the case, so, the fact that there is, or there was, a stapler on my desk, well, we would say that there's an explanation for why that fact took place or is true. And we can also explain, through understanding the reasons that this fact is true, why the alternatives did not take place, right? And we might say that for every fact about the universe, we can give an explanation of why it happened rather than its alternatives. Now, I think that Leibniz believes the claim that everything happens for a reason, but it doesn't seem to be directly focused on Spinoza's line of thought. I would say that Leibniz is a friend of the principle of sufficient reason, but Leibniz is going to believe the claim that everything happens for a reason through his claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. So we're saying that everything happens for a reason is because God looked at all the possible ways that the world could have been, and God thought that there was something special about this version of the world, so God brought this world into existence. So everything that exists is part of God's plan for the best possible world. Now, Leibniz is committed enough to this claim that he will even say that the existence of Judas, that is, the figure who betrayed Jesus and had him killed, Leibniz is going to say God found it good that Judas should exist, despite the sin that he foresaw. How does he claim this? Well, he says, basically, everything happens for a reason. The evil of Judas will be more than overbalanced. God will derive a greater good from it, and it will finally turn out that this series of events, this particular version of the world that we live in which Judas betrayed Jesus, the existence of Judas is, the series of events that's the most perfect among all the possible series of events. So in this way, Leibniz is ready to make a rather strange claim, right? God brought this world into existence, knowing full well that Judas would betray Jesus, and within this, we would say that, well, it's part of a greater plan, right? I would tend to think that when people say everything happens for a reason, when I hear people say this, they seem to be thinking much more in the way that Leibniz does, that bad things will pay off in the end when you take a wider view. Whereas it seems like some people might get away from Spinoza's line of thought, especially if they're willing to say that some things happen for no reason or randomly. Now, When we start to think about this idea that, well, God knows everything that's going to happen and everything that anybody is ever going to do, this is going to start to get us towards the question of free will. Before we get there, Leibniz is going to tell us about this idea of complete concepts. So whereas Spinoza told us that everything that you see is actually a little bit or a part of the big infinite thing that is God, Leibniz will not claim that everything is part of God. So Leibniz is going to say that individual substances are things that act, but which are not God. Here's how he puts it on page 12 in the section header for section 9. It says, each singular substance expresses the whole universe in its own way, and that all its events, together with all their circumstances and the whole sequence of external things, are included in that thing's notion. This is a really interesting thought, isn't it? So we might say that there are a number of singular substances. So I'm going to use this big S to represent a substance. And then we would say it expresses the whole universe in its own way, and all its events and the whole sequence of external things are included in its notion. So we might have a substance. Now I'm going to use some logical notation from the 20th century. So we can use uppercase letters to represent things, and we can use lowercase letters to represent predicates. So, we might say we have a thing, and then there are a number of different things that are true of it. So this is 20th century predicate logic notation. You can say that there's a thing with property A, property B, property C, and so forth. Now, we might say that this substance has all, and we might even say the whole sequence of external things. So we might say that, S stands for U, and Q or S, and T will stand for me. And we might notice that there are some predicates that are true of you that are also true of me. So we might say that, you were probably born after the Great Depression. So you, that's the S, and A means born after the Great Depression. Well, it's also true of me. I was born after the Great Depression. So we would say that, that predicate is true of both of us. And once we start thinking about how many predicates could be true of each of us, we should start to realize that there is both an infinity of predicates that are true of me. We also might realize that the predicates that are true of me will be reflective of the predicates that are true of you. So let's assume for a second that you were born in the 1990s, whereas I was born in the late 80s. So we might say that Goodine was born before you, and you were born after Goodine, right? So we might say that this truth about me, that I was born before you, and the fact that you were born after me, well, that would actually reflect a symmetry of properties between us. So we might say that each singular substance expresses the whole universe in its own way, right? Because I can talk about being born before you, but I can also talk about being born after everybody in human history each person in human history that was born before me. Or if we talk about the fact that, if Winston-Salem is north of Atlanta, then we're also going to learn something about the relationship of Winston-Salem to all the other cities that Atlanta is north of, right? So we know that Winston-Salem is north of Miami once we know that Winston-Salem is north of Atlanta and that Atlanta is north of Miami, right? So once we get into this mindset, we're going to say, like, look, there is an infinity of predicates that will apply to me. There are an infinity of predicates that apply to you. And we might even say that, you could place yourself within the entire arc of human history, of all time, really. And that all these things could be converted into truths about you. This is the way in which each singular substance, you are a singular substance, I am a singular substance, will express the whole universe in its own way. So, with that line of thought in mind, we might say that every substance is like a complete world and a mirror of God or the whole universe, which it encompasses, or which each expresses in its own way. Here's an example that Leibniz gives. God, seeing Alexander the Great's hexaity, sees in it at the same time the basis and reason for all the predicates which can be said truly of him. So what are some things that are true of Alexander the Great? Well, that he vanquished Darius and Porus. And God will know a priori, and not by experience, whether he died a natural death or whether he was poisoned. Something that we only know by history. So how do you learn that Alexander the Great died a natural death? I think that's right. Well, you figure out that Alexander died a natural death by going and getting a book. Maybe you Google it, you check Wikipedia, maybe you pick up your copy of the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire off your shelf, and you see if you can figure out how Alexander died. That's how we do it. But for God, God is going to know this fact about Alexander the Great just by thinking about the concept of Alexander the Great, because in the concept of Alexander the Great is every single predicate that is true of Alexander. So just like, in your concept of a circle that it has no corners, it could be in the concept of Alexander that he died a natural death. Right? And in this way, all the facts about a person from God's point of view are known a priori. That is, he doesn't have to have an experience or check a book to know these things. He's going to say that these things are like conceptual truths about Alexander. This should lead you to a question, right? We might ask, hey Leibniz, if God knows everything that we will ever do, right? So God knows in the complete concept of you whether or not you will be poisoned. You will probably not be poisoned, right? Now, we might start to wonder, well, has Leibniz, by having a God who looks at all the universes and picks the best possible one, including each and every one of us with everything that's ever going to happen to us built in, isn't that going to mean that there is no free will? Is that the price we have to pay for living in the best of all possible universes? You might be surprised to learn that Leibniz says no. Even though this is the best of all possible worlds, you still have free will. So in a certain way, it kind of seems like Leibniz is, as we might say sometimes, trying to have his cake and eat it too. Now, here's the key distinction. Leibniz is going to tell us that God knows with certainty what we will do. And this is the way in which he's knowing this a priori from our complete notions. But God is also going to be knowing these facts about us, even though these facts are contingent. Contingent facts are the opposite of necessary facts. And the way that Leibniz is thinking about it, God sees people acting for reasons, but the reasons that we act can incline us towards certain actions with certainty, but they don't necessitate us. Now, here's one example. Sometimes I like to go for pizza with my friends and family, and sometimes I will go to a very nice pizza place, like one of those Neapolitan pizza places where they've got the big brick wooden oven. And you go there, you look at the menu, and oftentimes at a fancy pizza place, there will be a pizza with anchovies as an option. Now, when it comes to Neapolitan pizza, I just love pizzas with anchovies on them. Such that I'll open up the menu and I'll look at all the options, and usually when I see the anchovy pizza, I'll be like, oh, great, my favorite. And I can basically put the menu down and I know that I'm going to order that one. Now, when my spouse comes with me for these meals, and, a nice fancy pizza meal, why wouldn't I have my loved ones with me? My spouse will often tell me, yeah, of course, Elliot's going to get the anchovy pizza. There's no question. We can pause and ask the question here. Just like God knows with certainty everything that you're going to do, my spouse knows with certainty that I'm going to order the pizza with anchovy on it. Now, think about this. I order the anchovy pizza for reasons. They incline me, and they incline me in a strong way that also makes my behavior very predictable to my spouse and even to myself. We can then ask the question, if it's a certainty that I'm going to do something, does that mean that I did it without free will? Some people might say, no. Actually, the way in which I would be ordering anchovy pizza without free will would be if I sat down and, when I sit down and look at the menu, an electrode, by the big pizza industry is like set off in my brain, and it causes me to, override all of my decision-making powers and order the pizza that way. Well, that's not actually what happens. Or it's not as if I've been chained down or had a gun pointed at me telling me that I have to order anchovy pizza. No, quite the contrary. I'm doing it of my own volition, we might say. And the fact that I have strong reasons for acting in the way that I do, and even that my behavior is very predictable, does not show that my act was unfree. There is still an important sense in which I could have, just ordered, the cheese and basil pizza instead. So, going back to Leibniz and his examples, he says, consider the example of Julius Caesar. So, if you think about the example of Julius Caesar, we can say that Caesar, well, one fact about him is that he became the dictator of the Roman Republic, and that in the process, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Now, here's what we can say. God could have brought somebody other than Caesar into existence, right? He could have had the course of history go different, such that the person born to Caesar's parents doesn't eventually become the dictator, does not cross the Rubicon. But even just that one difference means that we have a different complete concept. And we're going to say that a being that does not cross the Rubicon as a complete concept would not be Caesar. We could say it would be Caesar too, or you could just call this non-Caesar individual Schmeezer, right? A different individual substance who possesses a different complete concept. And so long as we're talking about Caesar from God's perspective, God knows everything that's ever going to happen to Caesar. And we might even say that from God's perspective, it can be deduced a priori that Caesar was going to cross the Rubicon. But here's the move again. Leibniz is going to tell us that even though he's making certain that we're in the best possible world, it doesn't mean that these other worst possible worlds, apparently it's a worse world when this potential dictator of the Roman Republic does not cross the Rubicon. Leibniz is still going to point out there's nothing impossible or inconceivable about this other world coming into existence rather than the one that we know and have. So we get an interesting question when we try to contextualize Leibniz's view about free will with contemporary views, right? We might say that there's two big questions that you need to ask a person about free will in order to contextualize their view. The first question is the universe deterministic? That question is a question about whether everything that happens has to happen. Now, in a certain way, we might say that, well, yeah, maybe we want to say that Leibniz is a certain kind of determinist, because we might say that every event is going to be a necessary consequence of God's willing it into existence. Right? This is the best of all possible worlds, and God willed that into existence. But we might also notice that Leibniz is telling us that there is still a sense in which it's possible that another world comes into existence. So it's not fully clear whether Leibniz is a determinist. We also get this question of compatibilism versus incompatibilism. So the compatibilist is going to say that the universe, even if it were deterministic, we could still talk about free choices. Now, the line of thought that I was examining earlier, that, God knows, what kind of pizza I'm going to order. God knows whether Caesar is going to cross the Rubicon. Leibniz is still going to say that that action could be free so long as it's coming out of the volition and reasons of the actor. That's a very compatibilist line of thought, that to act freely is to not be under outside constraint. But we also see a little glimmer of incompatibilism in Leibniz, right? Because Leibniz is going to tell us that he's really going to insist that it's still possible for you to do otherwise, right? So we might even say that there is a way in which you still have the power to do or not do, right? I still have the power to order the cheese and basil pizza instead of the anchovy pizza. And Caesar had the power to cross the Rubicon or not. And insofar as Leibniz is insisting on that kind of possibility, there does seem to be a line of incompatibilism, which would say that Leibniz would be a peculiar defender of a libertarian approach. So what I'm saying here is that under some moods we could read Leibniz as a certain kind of libertarian, but there are also ways in which we could read Leibniz as a compatibilist. So let's just go back on some of his claims. He will say that this universe is what necessarily follows from God's perfection. That seems kind of deterministic. Caesar chose to cross the Rubicon, and God knows with certainty that he would cross the Rubicon. Those two lines of thought sound kind of compatibilistic. So we've got some determinism, a little bit of compatibilism, but then he makes this claim that, well, it was a contingent crossing of the Rubicon. In that sense, we have some indeterminism in the picture. God inclines the soul without necessitating it. On page 515, he clarifies that necessary truths are founded on the principle of contradiction. He says you could get a contradiction when you claim that 2 + 2 = 5, or if you claimed that modus ponens was not valid. But the way that you and I act is not a matter of logic, so it's not necessary. Leibniz also points out that fatalism is a mistake. So fatalism is the view that no matter what you try, some outcome is going to come into place. I think that the mistake of the fatalist is to point out, or we can point out the mistake of the fatalist by realizing that people's efforts are part of the universe and part of the explanation of things. And in this way, we don't get to just stop trying because everything has an explanation. We also get this claim that God is not the cause of evil. He gestures towards this idea in his discussion of Judas on page 526, that evil is a kind of nothingness. But again, we kind of get a certain kind of determinism here because God knew that Judas would come into existence and betray Jesus. But on the basis of this claim that we act in ways that aren't necessitated, this would suggest that Leibniz is not really a determinist. Leibniz thinks that there is a sense in which the future is open. There's nothing forcing you down a certain fatalistic track. But in spite of that, God still knows what you're going to do, right? Even though they're not necessary truths, they can be known with certainty, and they can even be known a priori by God. So in a certain sense, that your actions can be known with certainty but still free, that lends a certain friendliness towards compatibilism. So in a certain way, we might think that, well, Leibniz is actually not clear with his view, right? We might say in some ways he talks as if determinism is true, but then denies that anything that you do is necessary, but then still thinks that God can deduce what you're going to do a priori just from the concept of you. That kind of sounds pretty necessitated. But maybe to push things on the other side, if we think that your actions are not known a priori by God, as a way of preserving free will, that might lead us to the problem of denying one of the excellences in God, i.e., the idea that God is omniscient. So, I think that this leaves us with the big question, and this is what you should be scratching your head about. Is complete divine foreknowledge compatible with free will? Is acting freely so indeterministic that the things that you do in the future are not even known by God, if there were a God? We might also ask the question, some people and their behavior are very, very predictable. Could a person's behavior be so predictable that we would say that they no longer have free will? Well, Leibniz might come back and say, look, predictability has nothing to do whether you're acting freely. God knows the ways in which certain free beings will act. And in that way, we might say that, look, even if God knows everything that you're going to do, and even if he's incorporating that knowledge into his plan for the best of all possible worlds, that setup still leaves room for talking about you as having acted freely. So I'll leave it to you to ponder, as I said at the start, whether Leibniz is giving us something useful and insightful that helps us navigate questions about free will, something, maybe a new position that helps us navigate the debate, or has Leibniz basically told us something that has an inherent contradiction or flaw in it? I'll leave it to you to decide. Thanks for listening.